Welcome to everyone. I am Layla Halal, the Director of the International Affairs Forum. We are very excited for today's presentation with Professor McClintock. We've had 220 registrants and are currently at 130. So thanks everyone for being prompt. This event was part of our regular scheduled season for 2019-2020, and we're really thrilled to be able to bring it to your living rooms. We are especially thrilled and thankful for the support of Desmond and Liggett Wealth Advisors, who have sponsored this event and who are really exceptional partners to us at IAF. We now have a message from Desmond and Liggett.
Hi, this is Zach Liggett with Desmond Liggett Wealth Advisors. My son Noah, we'd like to thank you for joining today's event and for your ongoing support of the International Affairs Forum. When Layla told Matt and I several months ago that a prominent scientist would be coming to town to talk climate change, we were absolutely thrilled. And although this pandemic has changed the format of the event, we're still very honored to be able to support Dr. McClintock's program. I hope that you'll leave the program with more knowledge to share with friends and family, and perhaps feeling a bit inspired to raise the bar on your own sustainability efforts here in our community and abroad. So with that, thank you, take care, and stay safe.
Thanks to Zach and Noah for that very warm message. Before I turn it over to Pam Lassers to introduce our keynote, a few logistics. We had some questions come in. Everyone is on mute and off video, so we control that. You don't have to worry about it. Breathe and take and relax. The other thing is that we will have Dr. McClintock's presentation, and afterward we will have a Q&A session. We have brought in a few community leaders active in environmental areas who will be asking questions. We also really value your input and want to hear from you. So please use the chat function to submit your questions. You can begin doing that during the presentation, and you'll find that chat function at the bottom of your screen. You can direct your messages, questions through the chat function to me. So now, Pam Lassers is an IAF Leadership Circle member with her husband, Harold Lassers. She has worked in luxury and adventure travel for more than 20 years. She has organized safaris for PBS and Good Morning America and for Oprah. She has exceptional experience in experiential travel, including experiencing our national parks and safety in this era of social distancing. So without further ado, I turn it over to Pam to introduce our keynote.
Thank you so much, Layla. Professor James McClintock is one of the world's foremost experts on Antarctica, an endowed professor of polar and marine biology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He's an award-winning teacher, scientist, and explorer. Most importantly, he's also one of those rare people able to explain complex scientific findings in a way that will challenge your understanding. His book, Lost Antarctica, Adventures in a Disappearing Land, describes the surprisingly rich and fragile ecology of the Antarctic Peninsula and explains the unprecedented impacts of rapid climate change. I met him through my work with Abercrombie and Kent. As a scientist, he wasn't sure that he really wanted tourists visiting Antarctica. But after his first expedition cruise, he realized that when people experience the white continent for themselves, they become passionate advocates for the global reserve dedicated to peace and science. Each of the 200 guests on his annual climate change cruise make a contribution towards equipment needed at U.S. Palmer Station for climate-related research. There they have the rare opportunity to meet the scientists and hear firsthand about their latest findings. Together, their work offers us hope that Antarctica may serve as both a wake-up call about climate change and a model for inspiring collective solutions. In honor of his many contributions to marine biology, The U.S. Geographic Board named the north side of the entrance to Explorers Cove in McMurdo Sound, McClintock Point. I'm honored to introduce Jim McClintock.
Thank you very much, Pam. It's a wonderful honor to be here today and to speak with everybody. The nice thing about having a point of land named for you in Antarctica is that I know in my lifetime I will never, ever be pointless, which is always something to strive for. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint for you, and I'm going to take everybody to Antarctica. And I will never forget the first time I put on a dry suit and dropped through a hole in the ice. It was about 8 feet of ice I had to get through into water that was minus 1.8 degrees centigrade, and looked down on a world that was just spectacular, a seafloor covered with sponges and soft corals and echinoderm starfish as far as you could see. And for 10 years, I worked at McMurdo Station down below New Zealand. And then over the last 20 years, I moved up to the Antarctic Peninsula, where my marine biological studies have focused more on climate change. And there's a reason for this. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the most rapidly changing regions of our planet. And I didn't really realize that I was going to a place so dynamic until I got there 20 years ago. So if you look at what scientists have found out about Antarctica, a continent the size of India and China, we know now that at the Antarctic Peninsula and the western portion of the continent are warming. And we also know now that the Antarctic circumpolar current, the largest current on our planet that goes around Antarctica in a clockwise direction, is also warming. And that's why you can see these little orange dots over on the eastern side where the ice shelves are beginning to melt because the Antarctic circumpolar current is warming. So the melting in Antarctica is not strictly on the western side, but there's also some going on the east. Well, how much warming are we talking about? Well, it just so happens that near where I work at Palmer Station on the western part of the peninsula, there's a station that has recorded air temperatures for over 60 years. This is Vernadsky Base, which is Ukrainian. And we now know that the air temperatures have warmed about 10 degrees Fahrenheit over that 60-year period, which is absolutely remarkable. It really makes this Antarctic Peninsula region as rapidly warming, or maybe even more so, than what we hear about going on in the Arctic. So what does this mean? Well, where I work at Palmer Station 20 years ago, when I was sitting at my computer in my office and heard a huge crash, I'd leap up and run down the hall, and my colleagues would gather at the door, pushing and shoving each other to look out and watch the waves come down the bay because the glacier behind our station, the Mar Glacier, had calved. It was a big deal. Now, when I go to Palmer, I was just down there 2 or 3 months ago, the Mar Glacier is calving several times a day. You don't get up and run down the hall from your computer. You simply take it in as part of the norm. And in fact, 87% of the glaciers on the Western Antarctic Peninsula are now retreating. Now we measure this retreat at Palmer Station. There's a research technician that once every few years puts on a backpack with a GPS and goes for a hike. And they're very careful to hike along the edge of the glacier, and they're being positioned or recorded by a satellite overhead. And then they can come back and add another line to our map. And here you can see about 3 years ago where the edge of the Mar Glacier was compared to back in the 1960s, when this little picture shows my friends Chuck and Maggie Amsler down there. Maggie said you could open the back door of the station and almost step onto the glacier. And now you have to hike about a half a kilometer to get to it. It's quite remarkable. You can see the recession of the glacier behind our station in this aerial image, comparing where it was in 1975, see how close it is to the station, and where it is about 7 years ago in 2013. And this is quite dramatic. Here is a wonderful new technology where satellites are capable of carrying instruments that measure glacial ice thickness. And these orange areas on this map indicate areas of glacial thinning. This reinforces what I told you earlier, that it's primarily the western portion of Antarctica and the peninsula that are showing a lot of glacial melt. And there's Greenland thrown in over on the left-hand side in the northern hemisphere, and you can see how much glacial melt there is there. Now, this was a big surprise to scientists. The Thwaites Glacier, which is over on the western part of Antarctica, was discovered to be retreating at a dramatic rate. We're talking 14 kilometers between 1992 and 2011. So why is this a big concern? Well, the Thwaites Glacier is effectively a cork. It essentially is where the ice sitting on top of Western Antarctica. Remember, Antarctica is covered with 2 to 3 mile thick ice. The western ice sheet is moving seaward towards the Thwaites Glacier, and it empties into the sea through that area. The concern about losing the Thwaites Glacier is the movement of that ice would be accelerated. And when ice is sitting upon land and enters the ocean, it contributes to sea level rise. And so this is a concern for us if we live in Florida, and we're already seeing seawater in the streets at high tide in places like Miami. So the Thwaites Glacier could be an important player in the future in terms of sea level rise. Now here's a map of all the different ice sheets that surround the Western Antarctic Peninsula, and I'm just going to show you one or two that have broken up in the past. Now remember, ice sheets are attached to Antarctica. They're floating in the ocean, and they're about 1,000 feet deep. Okay, so they're quite thick pieces of ice. Over on the eastern side, where the Larsen B ice shelf is located, a satellite took this image on January 31st in 2002. And note, you can see the striations in the Larsen B in this picture. A month later, the entire Larsen B ice shelf began to disintegrate. And about 2 weeks later, it completely disintegrated and floated out to sea. So this is a chunk of real estate, if you will, about the size of the state of Rhode Island that broke up and floated off. Now, more recently, you might remember about 2 summers ago in all the major news networks was news that the Larsen Sea had developed a huge crack. And in fact, that crack eventually opened up, and we had one of the largest icebergs that has ever been recorded, a chunk of the Larsen Sea, float away that was the size of the state of Delaware. So these, again, are remarkably large events. Now, there is some good news in the sense that ice that's already in the ocean when it melts does not contribute to sea level rise. But the concerning news is scientists know that these ice sheets serve as barriers to the movement of ice off the continent and into the ocean. And so when we lose these ice sheets, the rate of ice flow coming off the continent and into the ocean is accelerated. And scientists have measured about a 4-time increase in the rate of that movement. And again, this would contribute to sea level rise, and why we're predicting by the end of the century we could have up to 1 meter of sea level rise. Now, as a marine biologist, I'm interested in life. And the life of Antarctica is absolutely spectacular. And I want to talk now about how these rapid warming events are impacting the marine life along the Western Antarctic Peninsula. And probably the most poignant example I can give you is the Adelie penguin. And you can see the guy in the back of this picture. His name is Bill Fraser. He's a good friend of mine. And Bill came down to Palmer Station about 45 years ago now. And he tagged for his doctoral project about 16,000 pairs of Adelie penguins. Now that is a doctoral project. He came back, or has come back every single year over that 45-year period. And he has followed those 16,000 pairs of Adelie penguins. And you can see them in this purple line on the graph. So back in 1974, there's the 16,000 penguins in the purple line. And now we're looking all the way down to the right. And unfortunately, Bill told me most recently that the number of Adelie penguins on the island this year, in 2020, is going to be about 1,100. So more than 90% of the Adelie penguins on the islands right in front of our station have disappeared over that 45-year period. Now, at the same time, the chinstrap, the one in the top right picture, and the gentoo, the one in the middle picture on top, have shown up at Palmer Station, which is a little odd because they're warmer weather penguins. And as the peninsula is rapidly warming, they're extending their range into our territory, our station. And particularly the Gentoo, which now has over 1,000 breeding pairs in the area. They're actually moving into the rookeries that have been emptied of Adelie penguins. So what's happening to these Adelies? Well, Bill Fraser thinks a couple of things are important. One is that as it's getting warmer in the Antarctic Peninsula, it's getting more humid. And as the air becomes more humid, it's snowing more and snowing later than it used to. And this means that these unseasonably late snowstorms come in, and unfortunately, the Adelies are genetically programmed to come in and lay their eggs at a particular time, and then they get buried in snow, the whole colony. You can see that in this image. And sadly, when the ice melts, the eggs do not survive. They simply cannot hatch into chicks. And so we can lose an entire generation of Adelie penguins in these unseasonably late snow events that are caused, we believe, by the increased humidity with climate change. The other thing that's happening that's affecting the Adelie is the sea ice. I haven't mentioned sea ice yet, but sea ice is about 3 to 5 feet thick, and it doubles the size of Antarctica every winter. You can imagine that. And along the western Antarctic Peninsula, the sea ice is disappearing. We've lost almost half of it now over the last 25 to 30 years. The Adelie penguins use that sea ice. They're called sea ice dependent species. And they lay on their bellies and they toboggan across the sea ice out to the ice edge where they can get into the ocean and eat krill, those wonderful little shrimp that form the base of the food webs in Antarctica. Unfortunately, with the loss of the sea ice, Bill thinks what's happening is that those Adelie penguins have to get into the water and swim much further offshore to get to the swarms of krill than they used to. And they're using a lot of energy that used to be focused on raising their chicks, and that this is having an impact. And then also the krill themselves could be impacted by what's happening in terms of sea ice loss, because we now know that when krill are teenagers, they live underneath the sea ice, feeding on little plant cells called diatoms. And with the loss of the sea ice, we're seeing some reductions in the numbers of krill. So they're losing some of their really important habitat with the loss of this sea ice. And if krill are impacted, you have all sorts of potential impacts because so many of the marine organisms in Antarctica feed on krill, all the way up to the largest of whales, like these two humpbacks that do feed on krill, as well as some other plankton. They could be potentially impacted. I will say there's some good news about whales in Antarctica right now. The populations have recovered from the whaling days of over 100 years. And essentially now the populations are doing quite well. I've counted 75 humpback whales in a single afternoon on a recent cruise to Antarctica. So the krill issue has not become a problem for them yet. And it's really quite amazing to visit Antarctica right now with so many whales. This is any of the species that are dependent on sea ice could be impacted by its disappearance. And another one is the Weddell seal, which has an amazing adaptation. The female seal, not the male, but the female has ice chipping teeth. And when she's pregnant, she'll swim up under the ice and find a weak spot in that ice and chip away until she has a breathing hole. And then eventually, when that hole is large enough, she can slip up right through the ice, lay down next to that hole and give birth. And this is a wonderful adaptation because it means that her pups are completely free of predators, like the killer whales, the leopard seals that are out at the ice edge. And it's all because of those ice chipping teeth. Now, I don't think the Weddell seal is going to disappear like the Adelies are. Probably they may have to follow that sea ice as it retreats down the coast. And the leopard seals, these 10 feet long, 1,000-pound animals that when we're scuba diving near Palmer Station, we have to drop a siren in the water and alert the divers to get out because they can be quite territorial. These leopard seals have never been seen giving birth anywhere but on sea ice, on an ice floe. So scientists don't know what's going to happen as that ice disappears. Are they going to go to shore and give birth for the first time ever, or will they have to follow the retreat of the ice? It's a question mark. What about the little things in the water that we call plankton? Tiny little cells of phytoplankton, little plants, or zooplankton that eat the little plants. Well, Dr. Ducklow, Hugh Ducklow in this image wearing the white hat, is the director of the long-term ecological research program run by the National Science Foundation. And how fortunate it is that over 30 years of data has been amassed now on the plankton populations up and down the Antarctic Peninsula. You can see in this map the route of the cruise they do every year, a scientific cruise to sample the plankton. And we've got over 30 years of data. Can you imagine how much data that is? And I asked Hugh to do me a big favor and put that into a single slide for you. And I think he's done a great job. What you're looking at here in these cartoons, in the top two cartoons, you're comparing the 1970s and 80s with the 90s and 2000s for the tip of the peninsula. And then in the bottom two cartoons, it's further down the peninsula. So it's a little bit further south. So what's happened? Well, what Hugh says is that the weather has changed. We've gone from a dry polar climate to a warm, humid subantarctic climate. That means that the skies are cloudier, it's windier, the wind is churning up the top of the ocean. That's pushing phytoplankton deeper where they're having a hard time getting enough light for photosynthesis. And that means that some of the really juicy phytoplankton that krill like to eat are disappearing. So we're seeing less krill, and they're being replaced by salps, little gelatinous organisms that don't have much nutrition in them. Further down the peninsula, there aren't as many changes, but Dr. Ducklow thinks that that's coming in the future. What other changes are happening along the peninsula? Well, one thing is that you can find forests. All you have to do to find a forest in Antarctica is to put on your dry suit with me, drop into the water in front of Palmer Station, and we'll be swimming in a forest of seaweeds. They'll tower over your head. Some of the blades are 10 feet long, and there's over 150 species. I think in a warming world, we're going to have forests that are reasonably happy. They're probably going to extend deeper into the water because there's going to be more light with no ice over them. And they may extend further down the peninsula. But we also know from my own studies with my colleagues that these forests have chemical defenses in them to protect them from little crustaceans that want to eat them. And that with more sunlight, more energy, we could have different types or more chemicals produced that could alter who eats who within this ecosystem. So there could be impacts on community structure with warming. What about the offspring of sponges and corals and little animals that live on the seafloor? They're called larvae. You're looking at the baby larvae of a sea star in this picture. And this little larval sea star will swim around in the water in Antarctica for about 4 months to develop. We know from some work that colleagues have done that if you collect these larvae and bring them in the laboratory in Antarctica, and you warm the water up just 2 degrees centigrade, these larvae will develop in 4 or 5 weeks instead of 4 months. They are extremely sensitive to temperature. And this is because they've just never seen warming temperatures for a very, very long period of time. And so this means that they're going to be in the water column for a shorter period of time, which might be a good thing. It also means perhaps, though, that when they get ready to feed, a lot of these larvae are feeding larvae, that the plankton that they feed on them might not be available. They could show up at the cafeteria and the door's locked. It hasn't been opened yet. And this is something that climate scientists worry about in all systems of the planet. How are organisms in the future going to be potentially offset from their food resources? So Antarctic marine larvae may have that problem. What about species that have moved since it started to warm? We call this a range extension. Now, I told you already that there's 2 species of penguins whose ranges have extended. That was the gentoo and the chinstrap. But in this picture on the top image, you can see elephant seals, which have arrived at Palmer Station. They've moved down from warmer areas, established a breeding colony, they're having pups, and then the Antarctic fur seal in the bottom image has also begun to show up. Again, these are species that are moving south as it's warming. Now, probably the most poignant example I can give you of a range extension, or maybe we could even call an invasion. I'll set the stage with this picture. You're looking at a picture of the seafloor community of the Antarctic shelf. This is a very ancient community. It essentially is the result of when Antarctica separated from South America about 40 million years ago. And some species went extinct, of course, because of the temperature change, and others were able to adapt. There are some very conspicuous things that are not found in Antarctic seas. There are no sharks. There are no fish with strong crushing jaws. All 250 species of Antarctic fish are wimps. They feed on little crustaceans. There's nothing in the Antarctic with a claw. There's no crabs. There's no lobsters. So the species in this community, this ancient seafloor community, have never seen a crushing predator. You can pick up an Antarctic clam and crush the shells with 2 fingers. Everything is very weakly calcified. So you can imagine the concern when my colleague, Sven Thatchy, discovered 13 king crabs that were marching up the Antarctic slope. And this was about 13 years ago. This was the first time that scientists had ever found king crabs on the Antarctic slope moving up towards the shelf where that community lives that I just showed you. The concern, of course, that if the crabs get into that system, they could really create havoc since nothing is protected against them. Now, the reason that crabs had not moved up into Antarctica is because crabs do not do well at low temperature. And as you came up the Antarctic slope, it used to get colder and kept the crabs away. At low temperature, crabs act like they're drunk. They fall over. They can't feed themselves. They miss their mouth. This is because it's essentially like a narcotic. There is magnesium in their body fluids that serves as a narcotic. So we may have king crabs moving up. Now, I wrote a grant proposal with a colleague of mine to study the crabs, to see how many there were, whether they were reproductive, what they were feeding on. And while the proposal was being reviewed, another group of scientists discovered about 1.5 million of these crabs living in a very deep canyon, poised to move up the slope. Well, we were funded by the National Science Foundation, Rich Aronson, a scientist in Florida, and we took 3 cruises to Antarctica with this ship, and we leased a submarine from Woods Hole, and we pulled it up the Antarctic slope in 10-kilometer-long transects, taking pictures of the seafloor about every 15 seconds. If you can imagine the number of images of the seafloor we got from doing that. And we had to use a very important tool to scientists to analyze all these data to see if the crabs were there, called the graduate student. And we had lots of students analyze them, and to sum it up, we found millions of king crabs on the slope of Antarctica. The good news is they have not yet reached the shelf. And so we're hoping that that doesn't happen for obvious reasons. The last thing I want to mention is ocean acidification. Now, this is the poor stepchild to climate change, climate warming, global warming, whatever you want to call it. We just don't get as much press about ocean acidification. And if you're a marine biologist, this is concerning to you because this is a big deal. When we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, about 1/3 of it is ending up in the world's oceans. Oceans are sinks for carbon dioxide. And what happens when that occurs is there's a chemical reaction that makes the seawater more acidic. Antarctica is the canary in the coal mine for ocean acidification because they have very thin shells. If they dissolve the shell, they don't have much to begin with. And the colder the water is, the more CO2 is absorbed. It's a basic physics kind of thing. And so the Southern Ocean, because it's the coldest ocean, is the most heavily loaded with carbon dioxide. So ocean acidification is a challenge. You can go to the Southern Ocean today, and you could collect these beautiful little sea butterflies. They have a tiny little aragonitic shell. The whole animal is about the size of the tip of a pencil, and they're as common as the stars in the sky. And you can find them now in Antarctica, put them under a microscope, and see that the shell has started to dissolve. There are little etched marks on the aragonitic shell where certain areas have become acidic enough that they're beginning to be challenged by ocean acidification. Now, we have done some work at Palmer Station, my group and a colleague of mine and our students on ocean acidification. And we've looked at a variety of different species, crustaceans and mollusks, to see which ones are winners and which ones are losers as ocean acidification increases in the future. And to be, the bottom line is that there are some winners and there are some losers, but it doesn't take much of an impact to have a significant effect on the ecosystem. So let me just sum up for you these different things I've been talking about. The acceleration of glacial recession, the ice sheets breaking up, the annual pack ice retreating. We have animals that are affected by the annual sea ice loss. We've got phytoplankton communities impacted and seaweed communities and larvae. Things are moving around that haven't been there, like elephant seals and fur seals extending their range. We could have king crabs. And we have ocean acidification. It's really quite a remarkable change that's occurring in a fairly short period of time. We're going from a community that for millennia has looked like this, with very predictable annual sea ice, lots of Adelie penguins, lots of krill, a nice rich seafloor community and a forest, and all being fed by the very nutrient-rich ACC, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. Now, where we're headed, I think by mid-century, certainly no later than end of century, is we're going to lose the sea ice, and with it, the Adelie penguin. We're going to gain 2 species of penguins that have moved in to warmer areas, the gentoo and the chinstrap. Krill could be a big problem. We may lose a lot of krill and be replaced with salps. King crabs could be moving in. We don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. The macroalgal communities, the forests will have expanded their range. And again, this is all being fed by the ACC, that Antarctic Circumpolar Current. So you're asking yourself, big deal. Communities, biological communities, have always changed, which is true. But the difference here is that these changes are happening so rapidly. That's the key to climate change. When somebody asks you about climate change, tell them it's not the change, it's the rate of change that's such a big deal. And there are species that cannot make these changes quick enough, and we're losing them. So why should we care about climate change in Antarctica? It's a long way from our country to Antarctica, I can tell you. It takes me over a week to get there. Well, I think maybe the most important thing I could tell you is that there are very practical reasons to protect Antarctica that could be important to you. And one of the things at the University of Alabama at Birmingham that I'm very proud of is that not only has our work over the years looked at ecology, chemical ecology, and how chemicals are important in ecological interactions like predation and things like that, but also that the chemicals that we discover have the potential to fight human disease. And the short answer in Antarctica is yes. We have collected samples from McMurdo Sound and other places in Antarctica. And just let me tell you very quickly about a couple of our discoveries. This is an Antarctic tunicate. Kind of looks like a grapefruit. And they're all over the seafloor in front of Palmer Station. And we discovered a chemical in them we named palmerolide after Palmer Station. We sent it off to the National Cancer Institute. And guess what? They gave us a phone call. And when the National Cancer Institute calls you up and says they're interested in your chemical and can they work on it, you say yes. And they were able to produce palmerolide in the laboratory, which is absolutely critical. And we have just been able to sequence the gene that is responsible for making, if you will, palmerolide. So you could potentially take that gene and put it in a bacteria and produce this compound. Well, who knows? One day we could have a drug from an Antarctic tunicate that fights melanoma skin cancer, a type of cancer that's very deadly, and we have little of an arsenal to fight with. And here it is in Antarctica. And maybe even more important, the darwinolide that we discovered in an Antarctic sponge called dendrilla. We named this darwinolide compound after a group of compounds known as darwinomides. And it is very active against MRSA, that terrible bacterial infection that you get in a hospital. And it was the first chemical that ever had activity against the biofilm form of MRSA. So for example, if you're having a knee surgery and you have to have the knee replaced with something like titanium, you'll get a biofilm on that artificial knee, and you get MRSA underneath it, and the doctors may have to actually remove the insert, clear you of the MRSA, and then redo the surgery a second time. And I've spoken to surgeons about this. This is becoming more and more common. So my point here is that there is a repository of chemistry in this Antarctic marine community that represents millions of years of chemical evolution that we have literally just touched the tip of the iceberg, excuse that pun there, and that we don't want to squander because of climate change. Now, I used to get asked as I travel around the country lecturing on climate, is it really warming? And, you know, to be honest, I don't get asked this question anymore. It's been probably 5 years since somebody has really seriously questioned whether the Earth is warming. Most people believe it is. You can go online and Google it, global warming. I want to show you what the data that convinced me that global warming was real, and nobody could possibly take these data to task. These are what we call in science hard data, positive proof of global warming. So the question that I get is not whether it's warming. I get the question whether we as humans have any significant role in the warming. And let me just show you the data that convinced me that we do. And you've got to give me a really good explanation as a scientist to convince me of anything. And I'm certainly convinced by this. And these data come from Antarctica. This is an ice core. Imagine a core of ice about 3 inches in diameter that goes down through the ice sitting on top of Antarctica, 3,600 meters. That is a big, long ice core. And what you're looking at here is the ice core is laying on its side, and the bottom of the ice core is on the left-hand side of the graph, and the top of the ice core on the right. And the neat thing about drilling through the ice sheet is that you're going back in time. And there's tiny little air bubbles that are trapped in the ice at the time that that ice was formed. And in those air bubbles is a history of our Earth's atmosphere. And you can actually extract the chemistry, the air chemistry in those little bubbles. And that red line that you're looking at is the amount of CO2 that was in that little bubble in the ice core at that time. And the blue line is temperature, which is calculated indirectly. But I want you to focus on the red line because that's the one we really are concerned about. That's the one that has that CO2, that greenhouse gas signature. And you can see that big black line I've drawn across the top of those red peaks, showing that over the last 430,000 years, we've never had more than 300 parts per million CO2. Look what happens over on the extreme right-hand portion of the graph. And I've blown it up here for you. You can see that the CO2 in our atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution and the combustion of fossil fuels has skyrocketed. In fact, this graph is getting dated. I think now we're up to about 411 parts per million. In other words, there's been more than a 25% increase in a well-established warming greenhouse gas since we began combusting fossil fuels. And to me, that's a very strong signature of our having a big role in it. Now, at this point, I could say gloom and doom, but I don't want to leave you with that today. I want to essentially give you a story of hope and leave you with that, thinking about that. And how cool is it that this story of hope is from Antarctica? So let me first just show you this little Milankovitch cycle. That was to explain that up and down signature of the red line over that 100,000-year period. It's the elliptical orbit of the Earth around the sun in that 100,000-year period that explains that pattern. So in 1985, there were two technicians sitting at their desk in Antarctica who looked at each other and said, you know what? Our boss in England is not going to believe these data. And you know what? When they sent the data, he emailed them back and said, I don't believe the data. I want you to get a new spectrophotometer. I'll get it for you. I'm sending you back next year. You're taking those measurements again. And they did. And they couldn't believe it. There was a massive hole in the ozone over the entire continent of Antarctica. That layer of our atmosphere that protects us from ultraviolet radiation was essentially weakened or gone or thinned. It was a hole in the ozone. This created a big deal. This was a major event because it meant that organisms were susceptible to damage from UV radiation. It meant that when the hole drifted over New Zealand, and when I was living there about probably 10 years ago now, on sabbatical, you'd read the paper and it would tell you what level of sunscreen to put on in New Zealand as a function of the hole in the ozone. And it also influenced climate. Well, the neat thing about this discovery is in 1987, just 2 years after the publication of this discovery in Nature, a very famous magazine in science, 20 countries sat down around a table in Montreal, Canada, and ratified the Montreal Protocol that regulated the chlorofluorocarbons, the refrigerants that were destroying our ozone. And this Montreal Protocol now has 197 signatories. It is the most successful treaty of all time. And even better, it's worked. My colleague, Susan Solomon, who discovered the chemistry behind the destruction of the ozone at MIT, told me that the hole in the ozone is probably going to close mid-century instead of end of century now, and that the companies that produced this refrigerant did not go out of business. They used innovation and technology to come up with new materials for refrigeration. Hey, we have a wonderful example here of how we can come together as a planet and we can address these issues together and have a successful outcome. So what I'd like to do now to kind of wrap up for you is to talk a little bit about how a scientist like myself got involved in climate change outreach and educating the public about climate change. And when I started this about 15 years ago, the first thing I discovered was that I needed to write a book. I needed to write a book for the general public to tell the story about Antarctica and climate change. And I found out to write a book, you have to have something called a literary agent. And then I discovered that to have a literary agent, you had to have a book. So it's kind of a catch-22. And I was very fortunate that I had a colleague, E.O. Wilson, who is a world famous scientist, maybe the most famous living scientist on the planet. E.O. Wilson was a colleague of mine and was kind enough to recommend his Boston firm and make a little phone call or maybe wrote a letter, but I got a literary agent. I published my book. But what I didn't realize is when the book came out, there'd be some amazing things that would happen. One was a phone call I got from the director of the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, Paula Ehrlich. And she said to me, Jim, we're going to put you on the board of advisors for E.O. Wilson's foundation. And we want to publish, or we want to take your little published book there, your chapter on the Adelie penguin, and turn it into a 2 to 3 minute video that's going to go in all the aquariums and zoos across the country. It'll be a very poignant video about the loss of the Adelie because of climate change. And we love your prose. And I thought she was hinting around that she wanted me to narrate this little video. And when I said it on the phone, she said, no, we'll have Harrison do it. And I said, Harrison who? And she said, well, Harrison Ford, of course, he's on the board. And you can go to YouTube and you can watch this wonderful little 3-minute video with Harrison Ford reading from my book about the Adelie penguin. And he did a wonderful job with that. The other thing that happened as a result or related to the book was my getting to spend a day with this guy at Palmer Station in Antarctica, Bill Gates. And Bill showed up and it was my duty as chief scientist at the station to give him a tour around and show him what was going on. And Bill and his father, Bill Sr. were there, and his stepmother and his son Rory. And I had a wonderful time talking to Bill Gates, who's very interested in climate and renewable energy. And I took Bill and his father up to the room to show the video of the National Science Foundation activities in Antarctica, the research. And lo and behold, Bill and his father were sitting there. The IT guy came in and he could not get Microsoft to boot up, which was a very awkward moment, as you might imagine, in Antarctica. But it all worked out for the best, and Bill actually wrote a wonderful jacket blurb on Lost Antarctica on my book. Now, I also, as Pam mentioned earlier on, I've been involved in leading climate change cruises to Antarctica for Abercrombie and Kent Travel for almost 15 years now. And what a wonderful opportunity to introduce people to Antarctica, to climate change, and they come back changed. They come back ambassadors to Antarctica. They talk to their political people. They make a difference. And to me, that's a wonderful thing about these cruises and educating people about climate, is that they do make a difference when they return. I've also been involved in religious faith organizations in climate change and run various things like this spirituality and climate workshop with an Episcopalian priest and myself, with a group of about 50 people, learning about the similarities between the care of creation and the care of our planet from an ecological perspective. And then I'm also now the national face of the Can We Talk Climate campaign that's sponsored by the Nature Conservancy. And this is something that we all need to learn to do better, is to talk to people about climate change. We don't do a very good job as Americans discussing such a critical issue. And there's some wonderful things that you can learn to do to make that more effective. And let me just end on this note. I was very honored this year, or this past year, to be invited up to receive an award for the Explorers Club. It's an award for my research and outreach in Antarctica. But the important thing wasn't so much the award, it was who was on the stage with me. I was extremely honored that 8 Apollo astronauts were being honored. And at the end of the evening, in front of the 1,600 people in attendance in Manhattan, the astronauts were asked to say something, each that was really important to them about their life and essentially their Apollo experience. And the last astronaut to speak, you can see down there on the right, Rusty Schweickart. Everybody before him had kind of joked about, but he stood up and he said, you know, we've all been up in space, all of us sitting here on this stage, and all of us have had this amazing opportunity to look back at Earth. And when you're in space looking at Earth, you realize what a delicate planet it is, that thin little biosphere where all of the life-giving materials reside, and how important it is to take care of this. And I'll stop there and we can move on to the question and answer session. Layla?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for ending on a note of hope and action. We've had a few questions come in, and I want to highlight one before we bring in Liz to talk about our region. But Grace Walton weighed in. She said, how can a young person without wealth contribute to fighting climate change and making a difference in the world? And so I think that question is something that we can keep in our minds as we continue with this discussion for the next 10 minutes. I know everyone's really anxious to get outside, but Liz, if you want to come in and provide some perspective on our waters.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. McClintock, for such a engaging and informative and hopeful conversation about climate change. It is not easy to do, and it is so obvious how gifted you are as a storyteller and communicator. So thank you. I'm Liz Kirkwood. I'm an environmental lawyer, and I'm also the executive director of the nonprofit For Love of Water. And I was hoping to just provide a little context about the climate change impacts and risks here in the Great Lakes. And that matters, of course, because we are home to 20% of the world's fresh surface water in this region. And with increased demands and increased water scarcity and competition, it's absolutely vital that we as a region figure out how to protect these waters and address the urgent impacts of climate change. And as a Great Lakes Policy, Water Law and Policy Center, we view climate change from this water perspective, where we're thinking about the healing and restoration of every arc of the water cycle, and instituting legal frameworks where we're going to protect water as a publicly shared resource for all, addressing water equity issues, and thinking from one generation to the next. The kind of climate change impacts that are transforming the water cycle, as you know, are similar to the things that you mentioned about lake acidification. Lake Superior, for example, has increased in temperature, our coldest lake, over 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit. We've seen increased frequency of storm events, increased combined sewer overflows, flooding, runoff of pollutants, algal blooms, dead zones in Lake Erie, invasive species, and impaired water quality, much more. The most recent example you may have heard about just 2 days ago was the terrible disaster of the 2 dams down in Midland, Michigan, a really painful reminder of this tension between water infrastructure in general, care, maintenance, and long-term protection of our resources. When we think about the personal impacts, you know, Antarctica seems far away because it is, but when we feel these personal impacts here in our region, we know it's transforming the public opinions. And just 2 days ago, in the New York Times, there was a recent survey that mentioned that 2 out of 3 Americans say that global warming was either extremely, very, or somewhat important to them personally. And that is a refreshing statistic, because we know it's this durable and lasting issue that really is in the hearts and minds of Americans. And we've seen before our eyes during this global pandemic what is happening what happens with air pollution. You know, I think about New Delhi and those unbelievable pictures. When I turn to policy solutions, because that's where I go to, I can't think of a better phrase than we're all in this together. I mean, that's what this is about. And it means to me about the remarkable and bold efforts both individuals, businesses, local, state, federal, international leaders are going to have to bring together, amassing incredible technology solutions, thinking about renewable energy, shifting on efficiencies, conservation, transformation of electrical vehicles, new transportation policies, and then, of course, both national leadership and what Lorna Davis describes as radical interdependence, to think about the international scale. And then, of course, you know, funding for all of this is really critical. And in our region, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has been an extraordinary blessing to help restore and heal many of the Rust Belt legacy cities of pollution and that we've had. So with that kind of longer focus on the Great Lakes, my question to you, Dr. McClintock, is whether you see an opportunity for the radical interdependence and commitment to increase a collective international will to act on fair and equitable climate change goals. You know, what I'm asking is there a possible silver lining from the global pandemic to really bring together and bridge us together in a new way forward?
Yeah, I think thank you, Liz, for that. And I think there is. I've had people in my neighborhood that are fairly conservative folks here in Alabama who've come up to me and said, "I just can't believe how clean the air is, how blue the sky is," you know, and they're actually sensing the resilience of our Earth, and they're really getting hyped about that. The other thing I've noticed in my lecturing across the country is I'm getting a much more conservative level of invitation. I'm going to Rotary clubs. I'm going to churches. I'm in the South. You know, you wouldn't expect these things, and it's really beginning to sort of take off. And, you know, I think this does provide an opportunity for us to think about retooling and trying to work together. I know that we had a climate forum here in Birmingham about 3 months ago, where the organizers expected something like, you know, 15 people, the locals, to show up. We had 250 people come in the door from all different walks of life. So I think that there is a momentum. I think that if there are politicians that can capitalize on that and build these coalitions, I think it certainly is possible that we could make some big inroads. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We did have a question from an audience member asking, with the pandemic, what is the future of on-site research and the projects ongoing in Antarctica?
Good question. I've just been on 3 Zooms in the past 2 weeks talking about that very issue. Some of the science projects will be able to continue in Antarctica, depending on, you know, the densities of individuals involved and ships and movements between stations. The National Science Foundation and all countries, I believe, are being extremely conservative about keeping COVID-19 out of Antarctica. So, for example, my research project right now that's funded at Palmer Station will take a year off. We will not go to Palmer Station next year, but we will go the following year. So our research will continue. It will be successful. But they are taking a very serious look at this. So they're doing everything they can to maximize that all the science gets done, taking into consideration the issue of human health as well.
Thank you. Jim Lively is a strategic director at Groundworks and clearly wants to come in with a question. So Jim, you want to?
Oh, hi, Leila. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. McClintock. That was a really, really inspiring. It's just always so fascinating to see those images from Antarctica. I really appreciate that. So I work here in Traverse City at an organization called Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities. I'm happy to partner with Liz Kirkwood at FLOW on so many issues. For just the audience, wanted to mention some of the activities that we should be proud of that are happening here in our region or are based here in our region, starting with the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign, something that many organizations here in Michigan have come together out of concern about the oil pipeline in the Great Lakes, the Enbridge Oil Line 5 pipeline, which has both climate concerns as well as water concerns. And Liz Kirkwood has been one of the leaders on that issue. But we also have a Great Lakes Business Network, which I'm a part of, collaborating with business leaders who are speaking out in support of clean energy and concern about climate change. And also here in Traverse City, we are the home of the Michigan Climate Action Network, which now has, in just a few years, has more than 20,000 folks that are a part of getting together, speaking out for climate action. And it's also a Traverse City-based network. So as we think about the things that we've been able to do here in our region, I guess my question to you is, I appreciate we need to talk about climate. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about not just talking about climate, but making sure that we're accelerating the conversation and speaking forcefully to our elected officials for action. We really can't afford to wait. The time is ticking, and we know we need more action. Do you have any suggestions about how and where we can connect people to make political action?
You know, I get asked frequently when I finish my lectures around the country that, you know, what can I do? What can I do about the climate? And, you know, I tell them that the most powerful thing you can do is vote. That's probably one of the most important things. You can contact your elected representatives. I write them letters. I call them. I went up to Washington, D.C. and marched into the offices of, at the time, Jeff Sessions and my representatives, and made my case that climate was a key issue. So you can do a lot on the political end. Get involved in a nonprofit like what you're doing. That's wonderful. I love the fact that you have a number of stakeholders involved. I think that's really important. That translates into having some influence on political action as well. I'm involved in several local groups, Cahaba River Society here, the Nature Conservancy, where we also make a real emphasis of getting everybody from the right and the left and various political parties involved. So I think that that's important. I think that there's a need for scientists like myself to do a lot of outreach with the general public and to also work with organizations so that we can do a better job of connecting with politicians. It's difficult for me personally in Alabama, because we have some of the politicians that actually wrote the language of pulling away from the EPA and things like this in my state, but we do have others that are very progressive, Doug Jones, for example. So yeah, I think you just have to keep hammering away. And hopefully we'll see some things happen soon with a new direction in politics.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Jim. And you know, we had wanted to make this as interactive as possible because there is a large community involved in these issues locally in Traverse City, so their voices are important. We have a student with us, Cole Simon. If you want to come on, Cole, and pose your question.
Thanks, Layla. James, great presentation. It was really interesting to watch and very informative. I'm a recent graduate from NMC, and I'm planning on attending Michigan in the fall, hopefully getting involved in politics later in life and making a difference on that side of things. But I was really interested when he started talking about the seaweeds that are cropping up on the Antarctic shelf and the looming danger of the king crab. And I was wondering what kind of danger that presents to the ecosystems and food chains in the area.
It's a significant danger. And by the way, congratulations on going to the University of Michigan, Cole. I was born on the campus, actually, in the university hospital there when my father was a grad student. But anyway, it's a huge issue. In fact, this experiment has already taken place. All you have to do is go to the coast of Norway, and you can see the impacts of king crabs that were introduced by Russian scientists many years ago as they marched down, eating, consuming, essentially having a huge negative impact on the seafloor communities of Norway. So we know that if those king crabs that are coming up the slope in Antarctica get into those shelf communities, they're going to have a significant impact. And it's not going to be necessarily a positive impact. So it's a big deal, and it's something that catches the heart. It can be a little humorous at times. I did get a phone call from an Arctic fisherman asking when he could bring his crab boat to Antarctica. And I had to tell him that if you've ever seen The Deadliest Catch, imagine that on steroids. Welcome to the Drake Passage. So I don't know that there'll be a king crab fishery down there anytime soon. Thank you, Cole. Great question and good luck.
Great. Well, we've run over a bit. We've held on to 120 participants. Thank you so much, Jim, for this really informative presentation, and for everyone for coming and joining in the discussion. We intend to continue discussing issues of importance like climate change in the next season, our next season in 2021. We encourage everyone to join us and consider becoming a member if you can. Thanks to Desmond and Liggett for making this discussion happen. Thanks to Pam and Harold Lassers for introducing us to Jim, and for everyone for persevering despite what is a very difficult time for everyone. So thank you. Pam, did you want to say any final words before we sign up? Great. Thanks, Jim, and thanks to all who joined. Have a good evening.
Thank you.